Now, the Cultural Revolution is a phrase used to describe the chaotic 10 years, roughly from 1966 to 1976, when Chinese society was turned upside down at the behest of the then leader, Mao Zedong. The stated goal was to reinforce communist ideals across the country by imposing strict Maoist orthodoxy. However, most modern analysis, certainly outside of China at least, tends to agree it was an attempt by Mao to strengthen his waning grip on power at the time. During the movement, Red Guards, these were groups of Mao-obsessed youths, abused anyone seen as representing authority. Now, this could include elders, officials, intellectuals, neighbours and relatives, even in many cases their own parents. Victims were dragged into struggle sessions and they were then abused physically and mentally and forced to confess to so-called and often invented crimes. Tens of millions were persecuted during this time and jailed, and estimates for the number of deaths vary from hundreds of thousands to millions. Understandably, the period is an embarrassing one for the Communist Party, and for decades discussion has been strictly discouraged or certainly restricted to a very carefully crafted official narrative. But recently that seems to have changed somewhat, and discussion has begun to appear more frequently in Chinese media. Now, the turnaround seemed to come in mid-June of this year when a 61-year-old former Red Guard, Liu Boqin, published an open letter and an advertisement in a newspaper to apologise for the violence he had perpetrated on his teachers during that time. After that, across the country, several former Red Guards began to come out openly in the media to confess what they had done, making apologies to the now very elderly victims and asking for forgiveness in many cases. Well, to find out how net users are reacting to this new phenomenon of the previously unmentionable being brought up in public, let's now join our researcher Esther Dung in the newsroom. First off, Esther, before turning to the discussion about these apologies, can you share with us some general opinions you've seen about this period, the so-called Cultural Revolution itself?
Well, based on what I've seen, the majority of net users are understandably upset by this period of Chinese history. First, listen to this take posted on 天涯.cn. In order to bring down the dissent, the leaders launched this political campaign. Tens of millions of people across the whole country became their puppets and victims. And Shan Yuan, who says he himself experienced the Cultural Revolution, has this to say. The campaign was portrayed as punishing so-called capitalists, but it's the ordinary people who were the main victims. People lived in horror since they could be punished or even killed even for some small indiscretion or saying the wrong thing. And people were busy informing on each other, even couples. If the crazy campaign hasn't been stopped, I really couldn't imagine what would have happened to this country. But there are also some apologists who don't think Cultural Revolution was totally negative. 漫步天涯, who comments on Sohu.com. I admit that the Cultural Revolution caused some problems to society, but it also had positive effects. It effectively cracked down on privilege and corruption, which unfortunately are rampant in today's society. Those two phenomena have caused a series of problems, from moral decline to the worship of money and power. For me, these are more harmful than the Cultural Revolution.
Okay, now getting back to this recent trend towards of former Red Guards sort of finally apologising for some of the wrong committed during those times, what reactions have you seen to these?
Well, the majority of net users' comments have seen welcome this move on the one hand as a good start, but I have to say that most think it's still far from enough. First, listen to this comment on Baidu.com. The apologies do demonstrate the progress our people and society have made, and the fact that our media have even published these letters, well, that's a huge step forwards in terms of freedom of speech. Well, Liu Yuanlin says on blshe.com. The previous excuse was everybody was a victim of a Cultural Revolution, so there's nothing to apologize for. Now, finally, somebody has come out to say sorry. That's a good start. But as far as I'm concerned, it's not enough. A re-evaluation of the Cultural Revolution period has to happen on at least 3 levels: culturally, by the authorities, and by the general public. And Shan Yuan also echoes the need for some official admission of guilt. There were no winners in the Cultural Revolution, and so it's meaningless for us to try and figure out which individuals should be held accountable for which crimes were perpetrated on certain victims. What we need is our people and especially our leaders to reflect carefully on that period of history. What we need is a sincere apology from the government.
Now, turning to the timing of all this, after all, discussion was suppressed for so long and so completely. Why do net users think these apologies are coming out now? I mean, it's nearly 4 decades since all this happened.
Well, on this question, lots of posters bring the moral dimension into the discussion. They tend to think these former Red Guards probably don't want to bring their secrets to grave and want to relieve themselves of this mental burden as they get older. And this poster on Baidu.com says bluntly, if they really wanted to make apologies, they could have done it a long time ago. Why now? I think it's mainly because they hope to get some spiritual consolation. And in fact, the Xiaoxiang Morning Post recently interviewed a former Red Guard named Wen Qingfu, where this question arose. He told the newspaper that he apologized to his now 87-year-old teacher because he felt guilty for what he had done and felt he couldn't live anymore with this on his conscience.
Okay, finally, Esther, the younger generation in China today, actually anybody really under 30, is going to know very little about the Cultural Revolution. They certainly aren't going to learn a lot about it in school or in official publications. And older people who lived through those times are often reluctant to talk about it. Is there any discussion of this sort of enforced amnesia which really affects a whole generation?
Oh yeah, I've seen plenty of people who are complaining about that. A lot of posters think the government still has a lot to do in terms of dealing with that part of history. Feng Qingyang writes on his blog, the way we deal with the Cultural Revolution is like dealing with a criminal case. Some criminals are punished and then it's over. That's why so many people don't know about that history. We should learn from Germany, which faced up to its history and apologize for what it had done in World War II. And along the same lines, I'll finish up with these remarks from Shan Shibing. Our government should provide a better and a more open platform for people to learn about and talk about the Cultural Revolution. Forgetting history is simply a betrayal. Let our people know what happened and let our people have more freedom to make their apologies. That can only be good for the country.
Okay, thanks for that, Esther. And that was China Take researcher Esther Dung with some online reaction to this phenomenon of former Red Guards confessing and apologising for acts of brutality carried out over 40 years ago during the Cultural Revolution. Next up on China Take, some of the top trending phrases on China's most popular search engines.